In the summer of 1619, a 160-ton ship from the port of Flushing in Holland sailed in Chesapeake Bay. This Dutch vessel was under the command of Captain Joop and piloted by an Englishman named Marmaduke Rayner. They were seeking to obtain provisions after a season of raiding in the West Indies. In exchange for supplies, Joop and his crew sold more than 20 Negroes to the local authorities in the struggling English colony of Virginia. These black newcomers came ashore 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, and 1 year before the Mayflower arrived at Plymouth in New England. The people brought to Virginia by the Dutch man-o'-war are often cited as the first persons of African ancestry to set foot on North America, but in fact, others had come before them and had traveled widely through the southern part of the continent. The earliest Africans to reach North America arrived nearly 500 years ago as participants in the large expeditions organized by Spanish-speaking explorers. These Spaniards were the successors to Christopher Columbus, and in the generation after 1492, they fanned out across the Caribbean, competing to find a passage to the Orient and to locate gold and other riches. They exploited local inhabitants ruthlessly as they advanced. Within several decades, constant warfare, strange diseases, and brutal enslavement had destroyed the native population of the West Indies. The Spanish colonizers immediately began searching for new supplies of labor. One solution to the labor shortage was the transportation of additional workers from Europe. But most of these people were practicing Christians, so fellow Christians felt reluctant to exploit them. The Catholic Church in Rome and the Spanish government in Seville had less concern about exploiting non-Christian Indians, so a second option centered upon Native Americans. Expeditions were sent out from the Caribbean in various directions to the American mainland, seeking inhabitants who could be enslaved. But this strategy also presented problems. Some groups resisted fiercely, and others died rapidly from the diseases the Europeans had unknowingly carried with them from across the Atlantic. The aggressive Spanish empire builders wanted more slaves than they could get in the Americas. Thus, they began to seek more distant sources of labor, and soon they focused upon a third Atlantic region, the west coast of Africa. By 1500, European ships had been trading along the coast of West Africa for several generations. Besides purchasing gold and ivory, they also bought slaves and transported them north for sale in Europe. Soon, the Spanish began diverting some of these slave trading vessels to the Caribbean. Many of the first African workers found themselves forced to clear land for plantations or to dig for gold and silver. Others were pressed into service as soldiers, sailors, and servants. They were present, therefore, when the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortés marched against the Aztecs in Mexico in 1519, and when Francisco Pizarro attacked the Incas in Peru 12 years later. Africans were also present in the early Spanish forays into the continent of North America, as Juan Ponce de Leon and his successors probed Florida and the Gulf Coast in search of slaves, wealth, and a passage to the Pacific. In August 1526, for example, 6 Spanish ships landed on the coast of what is now South Carolina. Their commander, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, brought at least 500 people, men, women, and children, along with 100 horses and enough cattle, sheep, and pigs to start a settlement. They pushed south along the coast to find a suitable location, and they constructed a small village of thatched roof huts. But within months, Ayllón died, and bitter tensions arose over who should succeed him. In the midst of this struggle for control, African slaves set fire to some of the houses at night. Divided and embittered, 150 survivors straggled back to the Caribbean as winter set in. Almost all the rest, more than 350 people, died because of sickness, violence, hunger, or cold. But it was rumored that some of the Africans had escaped their bondage and remained to live among the coastal Indians. That same winter, the Spanish king approved another expedition to the Florida region, and 5 ships, commanded by Pánfilo de Narváez, set from Spain in June 1527. The following spring, more than 400 soldiers and servants, including some men of African descent, landed near Tampa Bay and marched northwest. They hoped to make great conquests, but they were poorly prepared and badly led. The Indians fought fiercely to defend their own land, and soon the invaders were separated from their supply boats and from each other. Most died in the Gulf Coast wilderness, but few survived long enough to be taken in by local tribes. Miraculously, 4 such men encountered one another on the Texas coast in 1534. They evaded the tribes with whom they were living and set off across the southwest in hopes of reaching Mexico City, the capital of the Spanish colony of New Spain. One of these 4 survivors was a Spanish-speaking African named Esteban, Stephen, the first African to emerge clearly in the pages of North American history. Another survivor was a Spanish officer named Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who wrote down their incredible story. He told how he had been enslaved by Indians and forced to haul wood and water, living on nuts, rabbits, spiders, and the juice of prickly pears. Heading west, they viewed the rolling Texas prairie with its herds of buffalo. Over all the region, they reported, we saw vast and beautiful plains that would make good pasture. They also marveled at the variety of languages they encountered among Southwest Indians. Cabeza de Vaca noted that there are 1,000 dialectal differences, adding that Esteban served as a primary go-between. He was constantly in conversation, finding out about their routes, towns, and other matters we wished to know. After 8 years in America, including 2 years traveling together throughout the Southwest, the 4 men finally reached Mexico City in 1536, the first newcomers from Europe and Africa to cross the huge expanse of North America. When they described the massive Indian apartment dwellings they had seen, known as pueblos, gold-hungry listeners assumed they had glimpsed the legendary and wealthy 7 cities of Cibola. Soon, Governor Antonio de Mendoza, the first Spanish viceroy of Mexico, organized a new exploration to seek out the 7 mythical towns, which were supposedly surrounded by turquoise-studded walls of gold. Since the black man was a skilled translator and a seasoned guide who remained enslaved, Mendoza purchased Esteban and presented him to a Spanish friar named Marcos de Niza, who had been selected to lead the expedition. In March 1539, the friar's party, with the Negro and other slaves and Indians, headed northward toward what is now Arizona in search of Cibola. According to an official report, the Lord Viceroy, having news and notice of such land, sent a friar and a Negro, the latter having come from Florida, with the others, as survivors of the party taken there by Pánfilo Narváez. There set out with knowledge the Negro had in order to go to a very rich country, as the latter declared and told the friar that there are 7 very populous cities with great buildings. They have houses built of stone and lime, being of those stories with which great quantities of turquoises set in doors and windows. Esteban, familiar with the region, proceeded ahead with his 2 dogs and a number of Indians. As the summer had increased, he sent wooden crosses back to the Christian friar to assure him of their progress. Finally, he approached a large community, probably the pueblo of Zuni in western New Mexico. Hoping to have reached Cibola at last, Esteban sent messengers ahead as usual, carrying his great mace made of a gourd which had a string of bells upon it and 2 feathers, one white and another red, in token that he demanded safe conduct, and that he came peaceably. But the Zunis quickly recognized the bells as Spanish. They linked this party advancing from the south with rumors of Spanish slave raiding and violence that were already circulating in Indian markets in the region. Zuni leaders blamed the appearance of foreigners for deaths that had already occurred, and feared a plot by which neither man nor woman of them shall remain unslain. When Esteban's messengers returned, they reported handing over the great gourd to the Indian magistrate. He took the same in his hands, and after he had spied the bells, in a great rage and fury, he cast it to the ground and willed the messengers to keep them packing with speed, for he knew well enough what people they were, and that they should, in no case, enter the city, for if they did, he would put them all to death. Determined in his course, and confident that diplomacy could prevail, Esteban dismissed this initial rejection as no great matter, and proceeded to approach the town, but armed men blocked his entrance to the city and confined him to an outlying building. They denied him food and water overnight, and they confiscated his trade goods. Negotiations proved unsuccessful, and when Esteban emerged the next morning, he and most of his company were attacked and killed by an angry crowd. Though bloody and wounded in many places, several of his Indian companions managed to survive. They returned southward to inform Fray Marcos of the death of his experienced black guide. The failure of the expeditions of Ayllón, Narvaez, and Fray Marcos only increased the ambitions of other explorers. Their ventures into the American interior would also include the presence of Africans at every stage. Even before the death of Esteban at the Zuni Pueblo, other black Hispanic soldiers and slaves were among those preparing to accompany Francisco Vázquez de Coronado into the southwest and Hernando de Soto into the southeast, and a few remain visible in the surviving accounts. Among those marching with de Soto, for example, was a man named Gomez, a Negro belonging to Vasco Gonzalez, who spoke good Spanish. In 1537, de Soto had received permission to invade Florida and carve out a province for himself and his followers in the southern interior. The Spanish crown had authorized him to raise an army, to establish 3 fortified towns, and to include as many as 50 enslaved Negroes in his plans. Gomez was among the black men forced to take part in this ambitious design. When the expedition landed in Florida in 1539, it contained 330 foot soldiers and almost as many others, artisans, carpenters, cooks, servants, and priests. They also brought herds of hogs and other livestock that would accompany their army to provide fresh meat. De Soto had taken part in Pizarro's successful campaign against the golden cities of the Incas in Peru. Now he was anxious to discover an equally wealthy kingdom of his own. But long marches through the swamps and forests of the Deep South revealed no such prize, even when he tortured local leaders for information and pushed his own company to extremes. The more De Soto's ambition was frustrated, the more ruthless his invasion became. At the Indian town of Cofitatequi, near the Savannah River, he finally received gifts of pearls in the spring of 1540, but he thanked the young woman leader, or cacica, who had presented the pearls by making her a captive in her own region and obliging her to march with his soldiers to assure their safe passage in her domain. De Soto's repeated cruelty toward the Native Americans assured that few would give him a kindly reception. His ruthlessness with his own army meant that many were willing to risk desertion in a strange land, especially slaves who stood to gain nothing from the entire enterprise. Several weeks after De Soto's departure from Cofitatequi, his royal Indian prisoner stepped off the path with several servants and made good her escape. Several members of De Soto's company also disappeared, including 3 Spanish-speaking slaves, an Indian boy from Cuba, a Berber from North Africa, and a West African, Gomez. The first 2 slaves eventually returned to camp and begged forgiveness, reporting that Gomez had elected to remain behind with the young Indian. Regarding the black man and the Native American woman, these informants said it was very certain that they had communication as husband and wife, and that both had made up their minds to go to Confiteteque. So by 1540, less than 50 years after the arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean, an African ex-slave and an Indian, cacique, were living together in the southern forests. By now, other European countries, jealous of Spanish wealth in the New World, were beginning to show an interest in the coast of North America. Several explorers, sailing for the French king, envisioned the possibility of discovering a short northwest passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Giovanni de Verrazzano hoped to find a route to the Orient when he examined the outer banks of Carolina and the mouth of New York Harbor in 1524. Jacques Cartier had similar ambitions when he sailed up the Broad Street Lawrence River in 1535. Even if they could not discover access to the Pacific, Spain's rivals could take advantage of the excellent fishing grounds in the North Atlantic, or if they dared, they could go after grander targets, attacking the Spanish galleons that sailed homeward regularly from Mexico. The annual Spanish fleet carrying gold and silver from the New World to Seville followed the currents of the Gulf Stream northward along the Florida Peninsula. Foreign ships lying in wait along the coastline could easily attack and capture stray vessels before they headed across the Atlantic. In 1565, therefore, the Spanish established a garrison in St. Augustine on the east coast of Florida. The purpose of this small port town was to help protect the passing gold fleet from marauders and to secure Spain's claim to the Florida region against European rivals. It became the first permanent non-Indian settlement in North America, and Africans were present there from the beginning. By 1600, roughly 40 Africans had been transported to the small outpost of St. Augustine as property of the royal garrison. Another 60 had arrived in the households of private individuals. These early African Americans, mostly men and mostly Spanish-speaking, were involved in erecting more than 100 Spanish-owned shops and houses, and in building Fort San Marcos on the north edge of town. They planted gardens and fished in the Matanzas River, selling their catch in the local fish market. Those who had accepted Christianity worshipped at the local Catholic church, and some drew token pay for themselves and their owners as drummers, fifers, and flag bearers in the local militia. But living conditions were harsh, and controls at the remote outposts were limited. So some Africans escaped to live among Indians, as Gomez and others had done several generations earlier. A Spanish document from 1605 complained that slaves had slipped away toward the south and intermarried with the A's tribe living along the Florida coast. Those who remained in town had little reason for allegiance to their owners. The authorities feared that they would support any invader who offered them their freedom, and one official, writing in 1606, warned others to be wary of persons of their kind who are the worst enemies we can have. More than a century later, St. Augustine would be viewed as a potential haven by a later generation of black Southerners, but that day was still far in the future. Just as blacks, both enslaved and free, took part in the exploration and colonization of Spanish Florida, they also participated in the creation of a new colony in the Southwest. There, from the time of Esteban, Spanish raiding parties had carried Indian captives back to Mexico to work in the silver mines alongside enslaved Africans. Before the end of the 16th century, Mexican adventurers pushed to gain control of the populated region along the upper Rio Grande. The reasons for immigrating to this region were many and varied. Some hoped to limit the exploitation of local Indians. Some hoped to convert the Indians to Christianity. Some hoped to control them and extract a profit. Government officials hoped to prevent European rivals from discovering wealth that had so far eluded the Spanish. but most of the settlers simply hoped to escape harsh conditions in Old Mexico and take their chances on the rough frontier in a colony to be called New Mexico. In 1595, a contract for this northern venture was awarded to Don Juan de Oriate, one of the last in a long line of ambitious and violent conquistadors, stretching back to Cortez and Pizarro, De Soto, and Coronado. Oriate put up the enormous wealth his father had gained from silver mining, largely with Indian and African labor, in exchange for the right to conquer, control, and exploit a vast region. His tactics proved strikingly ruthless, even in an era known for its brutality, and his grandest ambitions were never realized. In 1599, he crushed a desperate Indian revolt at the Pueblo Acoma so ferociously that he was reprimanded for his acts, and eventually he was forced to withdraw from his newly founded colony. By 1608, there were serious talks of abandoning the settlement of New Mexico altogether. Nevertheless, by 1610, a permanent mission had been established at Santa Fe, and many of those who had accompanied Oriate had demonstrated their determination to remain in New Mexico. In 1598, the first contingent of 500 colonists heading north included persons of varied racial backgrounds and social ranks. These newcomers to the Southwest included black and mulatto, that is, mixed race, men and women, both enslaved and free. For example, 3 enslaved Negro women and a variety of mulatto servants, both male and female, accompanied one wealthy Spanish settler, and other households were undoubtedly similar. Authorities in Mexico, anxious to prevent runaways from escaping to another province, ordered the death penalty for any Indian or mulatto attempting to migrate without presenting clear identification. So when several hundred reinforcements headed back to 1600, non-whites had to obtain clearance to depart. One mulatto, branded on the face as a slave, showed that his owner had given him permission to take part in the journey. 20-year-old Mateo Montero, another mulatto with the slave brand on his face, proved that the master who had purchased him 12 years earlier had recently granted him freedom. Isabel, a free mulatto woman traveling alone, produced an affidavit sworn by 3 witnesses to show that she was the legitimate daughter of a free Negro man and his Indian wife. A century before the first Dutch slave trading ship arrived in Virginia, therefore, had been an important and dramatic one for Africans in North America. They experienced all of the hardships and some of the opportunities associated with transatlantic colonization. Arriving without choice, they had served where necessary and escaped where possible, proving to be every bit as opportunistic and independent as those around them. Isolated at outposts in Florida and New Mexico, they were cut off from ancestors in Africa and from most of their black compatriots on the expanding plantations of tropical America. These pioneers, few in number and spread out across the northern fringes of Spain's vast New World empire, intermarried along the way with the Africans, Europeans, and Indians whom they encountered in their amazing travels. Descendants of Gomez and Isabel and other arrivals would live on in all the races of North America.